Hello and welcome to Unparliamentary Language, a political podcast that is 63 minutes of mayhem. And how are you, Rob?
Yeah, I'm very well, thank you. How are you?
Yeah, I'm good. And strangely face-to-face, which is always good. We're enjoying the festive hospitality of a scout group in Reading. So yeah, it's good. How has the festivities felt to you so far?
It's been very good. It's like a classic Christmas. I've just got very drunk and sat by myself in the corner, so I'm having a whale of a time.
And without further ado, as we're on a bit of a schedule this week, we're going to barrel on straight into headline quickfire. So I think first you wanted to touch on some news that's been happening over in the US.
Earlier this week, we heard about the very sad death of former President George Bush. That's Daddy Bush, not George W. This event was one that sort of put a spotlight on the Trump presidency in an odd way. It was a chance for everybody to look back at a less partisan time in US politics, or at least where there was a bit more normalcy. I think one bit of social media that did the rounds was a letter from George Bush to his predecessor, Bill Clinton, that sort of said, this is a great role, I'm sure you do very well. And I think many people speculated that Trump might not be so open and warm to whoever his predecessor is. There was also a lot of social media around when Trump arrived at George Bush's funeral. He notably shook the hand of Obama and Michelle, but Bill was ignored and Hillary Clinton just kept staring straight forward like he wasn't even there. In conclusion, it's been quite a sad moment for American politics. Everybody's had a time to reflect, and even though Trump was seen as being more presidential, because I don't know, he didn't pull a McRib out of his pocket at the actual funeral or anything like that, he's had his own troubles this week that have sort of brought more to light about how unusual this presidency is.
Yeah, and I think some people saw it as a bit of an end of an era, because George Bush Sr. was the last of the kind of veteran presidents who had seen action in World War II, and they were veterans themselves, and so there was this kind of, it wasn't entirely consensus politics, but there was more bipartisan, across the aisle kind of stuff going on just to get things done. And I read an article, which I'll try and find for the show notes, that was very much talking about how after his presidency, we started to have a lot more of this very partisan politics, especially in the early 90s, people trying to stop Clinton and stuff like that.
Yeah, that's very true. I think if you ever go back and look at the 1992 election, which Bush lost to Clinton, that was a very odd election. It had the inclusion of Ross Perot as a third-party candidate, who was talked about a lot in the 2016 election as probably the most Trump-esque candidate we've had. So it's odd to see that, both Clintons were sort of up against a Trump-esque candidate. One of the reasons that Perot lost or was unable to make a dent was because he sort of split the Republican vote by having Trump in 2016 as a Republican candidate. That might be how he had his path to presidency. So yeah, definitely an end of an era there. Yeah, the only other bit I wanted to touch on as well was the news that Michael Cohen's had his testimony in the Mueller investigation come out. It was quite heavily censored.
There was some very good investigative work on the internet where someone found Donald Trump's name earlier in the document, highlighted it, got out the rectangle tool to black it out, and worked out how wide it was in pixels, and then later found a thing about who the charges would be against, and were like, that's exactly the same size. Coincidence? I mean, it could just be coincidence. Lots of words are a certain width, but it was quite funny watching people like on Twitter try and work out what they could from the redacted document.
The other bit of information that's gone around is that there's been a individual number one that was pointed out in the document, which was meant to conceal the identity of a certain individual. However, it goes on to say individual number one later went on to win the presidency. So there's only narrows it down to maybe Bill Clinton, Obama, or Donald Trump. And considering that the charges that are leveled against individual one in this document, which is the paying off of two women during the campaign, which would be a campaign finance violation, reveals the fact that Trump may actually be in line for at least some sort of prosecution later down the line. It's a bit controversial because Trump in the past has said that he may be able to pardon himself. Yeah.
I mean, I think that's the thing that people are like very unsure about, right? I think most people would say he can't.
Yeah, it's one of those things where everybody says, like, there's no legal thing saying you can't do it, but you almost definitely shouldn't do it, because if you do, then it'll be a massive constitutional crisis, because it essentially means Donald Trump could walk down the street shooting people and nobody could stop him because he could just keep pardoning himself. Obviously, that's a very extreme situation. That's not going to happen. But, Donald being Donald, he might just do it to see what happens. The pardoning himself about the women's payments, not the shooting people in the street, I'd like to clarify.
Yes, that was a reductio ad Trump, I think.
Yes.
And so for our next headline, in the Daily Mirror, 63 Minutes of Mayhem.
Yes, this was the big news midweek that Theresa May's government had lost 3 quite significant votes on the EU referendum deal. This isn't the big one that we're waiting for on Tuesday, and we'll talk about more of that later, but these were just slight side amendments that the government thought they may be able to win. One of the most significant one was the Grieve Amendment. What the Grieve Amendment does is it takes power away from the Prime Minister and puts it in the power of MPs. They can essentially force the PM to come up with a different deal within 21 days, or they can throw her out. The other big loss that the government had was the one where they were held in contempt.
Oh, yes. Well. Yeah, I mean, that sounds bad, right? To be held in contempt of Parliament. But I think we had a bit of a discussion in the middle of the week where we were like, actually, it's as long as they publish this document, it might just be that. It's like a slap on the wrist as opposed to a real problem at this point.
Yeah, it's a big slap on the wrist. It's really embarrassing because no Parliament should be held in contempt of itself. So Parliament is sovereign. So that means all the MPs together, if they agree on something, it must happen. That's the rules. So what happened was Parliament voted in a way that was different to what Theresa May wanted. They said, we want this legal advice published. And the government, Theresa May's cabinet, refused to publish that legal advice. So they had to go back to Parliament and say, no, you really need to do this. And they were forced into a fairly embarrassing climb down, where on Wednesday they had to reveal what that legal advice was. It was particularly on the issue of the Irish backstop. Essentially, what came out of that was that the Irish backstop, although it says 20XX, which we all assumed to be 2099 when this could end, in reality it was sort of indefinite. It could go on to the year 3000 if they wanted to, if nothing was ever sorted. So, yeah, that's even worse for the government than it could have been. Yeah, to lose those 3 votes was really embarrassing for the Prime Minister. Maybe what was more worrying was that they lost with the support of the DUP as well. So they went into a deal with the DUP who agreed to support the government, and they did, but they lost so many Tory rebels along the way that the government was defeated 3 times. So that puts big question marks over if Theresa May's government can continue if she loses the big vote on Tuesday.
So I think it's something you mentioned to me in the middle of the week, and I've also seen around in the headlines and in on Twitter and things like that. A government that can't pass votes doesn't survive very long.
Yeah, essentially, you're left in a big stalemate. I think I'll go into more detail on that when we go into our what might happen after Tuesday. But yeah, I don't see this government lasting very long if they're unable to keep their own MPs on side.
So for our next story in the Financial Times, Huawei executive arrest sparks market turmoil and Beijing fury.
Yeah, this is the story that the daughter of the Huawei CEO, and I believe that she's also the financial
CFO.
CFO, yeah. And I think she's also like one of the big financial directors in the company, was recently arrested in Canada. The reason why she was arrested is because the Chinese company is alleged to have broken sanctions against Iran, which obviously the US and Canada take quite seriously, and it's believed that she'll be extradited to the US to face these charges. This has come at quite a tense time for US-Chinese economic relations, particularly with the trade wars and the sanctions that we've been talking about in the past going on. Midweek, Donald Trump and the Chinese leader met the G20 summit, where they agreed to put a halt on trade tariffs. However, with this news, the markets were still spooked, and that wasn't enough to stop some stock markets. I believe the UK stock market lost 2% of its value in a day. The US stock market had a slightly delayed reaction because the stock markets were closed for George Bush's funeral. So they had sort of a double hit when they opened the day after this news. It's one that's, it's a story that keeps rumbling on. I know they said about a lot of stories, but if she is extradited and this continues to happen, maybe those conversations that happen between Trump and Chinese president don't mean anything and the trade war sparks up again. And that would be a big problem for the world economy.
It's slightly ironic that we're sat in front of an old newspaper that has an advert entitled China, Our Ally, that I might have to read out later as our ad break because we don't have an actual sponsor this week. And now from The Independent, more than half of voters now want to stay in EU.
This is something that we've talked about previously with the sort of prospect of a second referendum and what would happen if one was to go ahead. This poll is one that seems to be quite positive for Remainers, that says people's opinion has changed and moved on. I don't have the actual figures on, well, if they say more than half, then that's really good. But I would remind you in quite stark terms that in 2015, when we had this election, most polls were saying more than half of people wanted to stay in the EU and carry on. So you can only believe so much with polls. Everybody says that. We've had a lot of different polls this week on how governments are doing. We'll touch on that later. And it's something I want to get into more about. Everybody says, oh, you can't trust the polls. The polls were wrong in 2015. They were wrong in 2017. They will be wrong again. They are, however, our only scientific measure of measuring public opinion. So rather than, your ill-informed reckon of what you think's going to happen, everybody has a little reckon of what they think might be going on or what's happening in their circle of friends. It is worth looking at the polls, seeing if they're in. My advice would always be that they can be wrong 3% either way, I'd say. So maybe more than, if it's 51, then it could be 54 people support it, or it might actually be, oh dear, only 48%, which is pretty much what happened at the actual referendum. So if they're within a margin of error, that should mean it's a toss-up, we're really not sure. But if you see things saying 60-40, in all likelihood, that 60% really is going to win.
And our final headline from the Mail on Sunday, will kind of lead on into our main story. May, back me or get Corbyn and no Brexit.
I think I'll just roll straight onto our main story with this, which is Theresa May, after 2 weeks of intense parliamentary debate, now finally has to put her deal to the Commons. So this vote will happen on Tuesday the 11th, and it will be the biggest test for May's sort of personal power, charm and charisma. She's been on a big tour in the last 2 weeks around the country trying to sell the deal to the general public, really, knowing that she lacks some of the support from her own MPs. We had one of our close friends received a letter from his MP the other day.
Oh, yes, yeah. Well, I mean, I'll give you like the summary of it, I suppose. But dear resident, I'm writing to you because I'm concerned about Brexit and the very serious implications for our country and our local community. The negotiations have produced a deeply flawed draft withdrawal agreement, and I am very concerned about how our relationship with other European countries could develop in the future. And I think the summary is he's summarising the steps that are going to happen. So Parliament voting on the deal, what happens if the government's defeated and if a general election is not possible. But basically he's asking for all the feedback of his constituents. And I suppose that's quite interesting if you contrast it with my MP, who's a Lib Dem. So he sent out a letter being basically, we're not backing this deal. Which is very, I mean, he wanted feedback, but the core takeaway is he's not going to vote for this come Tuesday. Whereas I think I'd rather have someone basically polling me for what I think, trying to represent the constituents' view now. But it's interesting that kind of ties into what Theresa May was doing last week, this tour of the country, trying to convince constituents that her deal was right. And it doesn't look like that's really worked from the polls. But I mean, it's kind of interesting, how many MPs are going to be voting based on what they think and how many on what their constituents want them to do.
Yeah, I think that depends on which party is in your local constituency. So the Lib Dems campaigned in 2017 on a very strong platform of, no, we want to remain, we will give you a second referendum. Very unlikely that any of them will vote for any deal that makes them leave. Conservatives and Labour, some of them will be Remain-leaning Conservatives in their own heads, but might be in a Leave constituency, so they may feel bound by that to follow the will of their constituents. The same for Labour. So having a Conservative MP saying, I'm not sure about this deal, but what do you guys think? If I get suddenly 80% of all the letters that come into my office are saying, no, you need to support this deal, then Theresa May's plan will have worked and she'll have won the country. And that's sort of her gambit. The other part of May's gambit, which is slightly odd, I think it's encapsulated perfectly in that in that headline there. So what she said is, back me or get Corbyn and no Brexit. So that's her speaking out of one side of her mouth to the Brexiteers, saying, you might not like this deal, it's not perfect, however, it could be much worse, you might not get anything you want at all, and not only that, but you definitely don't want Jeremy Corbyn in, you still want a Conservative leading. Out of the other side of her mouth, she's trying to speak to centrist sort of like Labour MPs, saying, if we don't do this, we'll get no deal. And it'll be terrible, and the whole economy will crash, and you don't want that, so support my deal. So she's two almost very conflicting opinions going out at the same time. And I don't know if she realises this, but we can hear both, Theresa. We can hear them both really clearly. I know you're trying to split your message, but it's just out there. And to me, that's one of the reasons why it seems to have failed to swing the country in any wild direction. So again, I will preface this by saying this is sort of my feeling. This is not based on any scientific opinion, but I feel that if the deal had massive waves of public support, we would have seen newspapers supporting it. We would have seen big polls on the front of the Daily Mail, the Daily Express, the leaving papers saying, no, this is May's deal for Britain and everybody supports it. But we haven't. We just haven't had the science there. Compare that with The Independent running their story on saying that, okay, now the support for remaining in the EU is getting bigger. It seems to me that this deal seems to have at least united people. Well, some people, or at least tipped the balance in the favour of Remain. I don't know what you think on that.
I think the thing here is that Theresa May seems to have stuck around a lot longer than people anticipated. And she was able to ride a lot of the negative feeling. So, I mean, she took on a country that was split down the middle, pretty much 50-50, as we know from the vote. And we've discussed many times how hard it is for her to do anything that will please everyone because, well, I mean, I would say it's impossible. She's never going to please everyone. She's, best case, maybe she came up with a Remain-like deal that didn't annoy most Remainers and some Brexiteers would be okay with because on paper we were leaving. But really it would be like, a bit like the Norway situation. So maybe there's a deal like that where she actually somehow gets more than 50% of the country on side. But with basically any deal that happens, it's going to be less than 50% of the population who like it. Even if you get a Brexit, like the hard Brexiteers, maybe if you've got the hard Brexiteers idea of Brexit, maybe 20% of people are like, yeah, that's what I really wanted. And then you have 30% of people who still voted Brexit being like, that's a bit hard, really. We didn't want to lose all these things that we had and be poor now. So, yeah, it was always going to be tough. And I feel like she's kind of got to the end of her political capital that she's had with people. She's somehow managed to, impressively so. Like we keep talking about how the Tory government has managed to keep about 41%-ish in the polls, just ahead of Labour, consistently since the general election. And I'm not sure how she does it, really. It's impressive because there's not... We can see the kind of spin that's trying to be put on these things. We can pick that all apart. And somehow it's worked up until now. And now we've finally got a deal and we can actually... I suppose maybe that's it. Maybe now that we actually have something to point to and criticise, it's a lot easier to criticise than the kind of woolly criticism we had before. Yeah,
it has worked till now, but I would say it's barely worked. And if you look back at Theresa May's history, how she became Conservative leader in the first place, she became Conservative leader without even having a vote. Everybody else dropped out, and she was sort of the one left holding the ball. Like, okay, I guess I'll run this Brexit thing now. She then called a general election in 2017, which she she won, she got the most MPs, but she didn't get a majority. She lost. And the reason why she lost, or one of the big reasons many people pointed out, was that her personal campaign, her own will, so that she didn't want to do a debate on TV, she came across very badly to the general public. She lost that support. This is the person that we still decided to say, okay, but I guess you're the best person to go and negotiate the deal. I don't think we should be surprised that it's could have come out in this fudge, in this odd way that nobody's going to support it. It appears that, one of Theresa May's best characteristics is her ability to get her head down in the face of criticism and carry on regardless. But it's got to a stage now where I think that's almost foolish. We are barreling into a vote on Tuesday, which from the moment this deal was released, we were talking about it 2 weeks ago, and now Parliament has had 2 weeks to debate it. We said last week, probably not going to pass. Everybody else said, well, this doesn't seem to... She hasn't been able to weave this political magic to get these all sides on board. The DUP are already saying that they'll reject it. This big bunch of Conservative MPs are saying they're going to reject it. Labour's definitely not on side. So it seems foolish for her to go ahead with this Commons vote when it seems almost inevitable that she'll lose.
I know we touched on this last week, but if she loses on Tuesday, where does that leave us? I've seen a lot of infographics the last week. Do we want to kind of summarise the main points there?
Yeah, I'll give it a go. So when you're listening to this, the vote may have already happened, but it's my impression that the vote will be defeated. So what happens next is that the government can then... There's a couple of options. The government can say, right, Theresa May will go back to Brussels, try and get concessions out of Brussels and come back with a different deal, which she may be allowed to do. The biggest thing that may happen after that, though, is Labour will go ahead with a motion of no confidence. So they've got two options with a motion of no confidence. They can say, I've got no confidence in the government, so we want the Conservative Party out. The problem with that is that the DUP, despite saying that they will vote down Theresa May's Brexit deal, have already come out and said that they will support the Conservative Party to make sure Labour don't get in.
And it's also a 2/3 majority, right? It's not a straight 50-50 vote for that vote of no confidence.
Yeah, that's correct. So even if you had the DUP on side, or even if she won a majority, it'd still be really hard for Labour to do that. So the other card Labour can play, which I think is the more likely outcome, is that they will say a vote of no confidence in the leader, Theresa May. This is something that we've already said that she doesn't have the support of her own, of a lot of Conservatives within her own party. The DUP may be more willing to get rid of Theresa May in favour of another leader, and Labour, everybody else, will certainly want to see her downfall. I think that's probably the most likely, and that might mean the end of May's political career. The other situation we may have is that even if that vote loses, we could still have the 48 letters from Conservative MPs to trigger a new leadership election.
And the way that, we saw when people were talking about that in the last few weeks, that letters that were, say, submitted in September are still held. So it's just a question of tipping over some extra people. It's not like they have to start sending them again. They just need to get whatever... we know they're under 48. That's all we know. We think it's somewhere around 30, because I think we said 27 in a previous episode. So they just need to convince another 20-odd people to send in those letters. Yeah,
I think that's likely. But then again, in a leadership election, it's quite possible Theresa May may do that and win again, because the other candidates are probably going to be Boris Johnson, maybe Jacob Rees-Mogg.
Boris Johnson, who got a haircut this week. Watch out.
Yeah, I think he's fully gone in guns blazing. I just read a tweet actually that said that Boris was looking to propose his own deal, which was something on the lines of, we should refuse to pay the EU the 39 billion that we've promised them until we get the trade deal that we want, which is, playing hardball. That's what Brexiteers will want to hear, but again, might not be the most feasible way to persuade the EU of what you want to do. So after all of that, so we could have a situation where Theresa May faces a vote of no confidence, probably would win that. I think even if she's got one against her leadership, although she might lose, that would probably trigger a leadership election within the Conservative Party. And it's entirely possible that she comes out as a winner again in that. The other possibility is that, Theresa May has said herself that Labour could get in, and Labour will certainly be pushing for a second general election. But with the way that Parliament is balanced, the need for 2/3, that's unlikely to happen as well. So,
and I think it would be, the government would be foolish to run a general election right now. They're probably, people are going to be most disenfranchised with the government right now. And also in the lead up to Brexit, it's just going to make a terrible mess for everyone. We don't want any more delays, really, and that would be a massive delay and essentially take us out of it for about a month.
Yeah, it would force us to at least be out for a month, and the EU have already said that they'd be happy to extend Article 50 beyond March when it's meant to be triggered. So, yeah, that's another option. So, general election unlikely. Theresa May likely to keep ploughing on unless something big happens. A lot of people have said, what about the Queen stepping in? Because You learn this when you're doing politics and your basic little book of the Constitution, that the Queen can come in and say, the Conservatives are unable to get their main policies through. They're not a functioning government. Why don't we give it to the minority party, which in this case would be Labour, and let them have a go? The problem is that the Fixed Term Parliament Act of 2011 stops the Queen having that influence anymore. That was the act that was meant to guarantee that we had an election every 5 years at least, or it would be regular. Every government would have at least 5 years to go. Obviously, that was broken not broken, but people decided within Parliament itself that they were ready to have an election in 2017. Again, I think this means it's unlikely that the Queen can step in. She can't do anything. Labour can't really come forward with a run as a minority. So again, I think that's unlikely to happen. The other scenario that has been put out is that you get a coalition government, almost like a wartime emergency coalition between central Conservatives and central people within the Labour Party.
So that would be very much, we've got to get this done, guys. Let's go. Maybe not bring back rationing. That probably wouldn't be great, especially not around Christmas. But, I'd like to think that even now with quite divisive politics, that if something really needs to get done, the whole country could actually finally get behind that kind of idea. I mean, the rhetoric has been very divisive recently, so it would remain to be seen. But I'd like to think that if we got to that position, people would be able to band together and at least not screw us over as much as no deal.
Yeah, that's the point, that the whole spectre of no deal is the thing that would have to bring the country together. If you're really staring down the barrel of that and you're thinking, oh my goodness, we're going to have 6 months of queues at Calais or Dover, the ports, which is something that's been touted in the newspapers as something that could happen, shortage of insulin, food prices going up. If that was the alternative, then I think a government in the national interest might be something that comes together. But that's very pie in the sky. It's all very what's you're just kind of throwing things at the wall and seeing what happens. We won't really know what happens until Tuesday, and I think we probably won't know until a couple of weeks after that. In summary, I think the most likely scenario is that Theresa May loses this first vote. She's forced to go back to the EU, and then we have a second vote with a slightly adjusted deal. I don't think it'll change a lot. I think that'll be the one where Theresa May just is like, right, guys, we really need to get this done, or it is no deal. And if she loses that, that's when the proverbial poo will hit the fan.
Always one to end on a hopeful note there, Rob.
Merry Christmas, everyone. Sleep tight.
Advertising from 1942. China, our ally. Peace-loving China, Britain's friend over many years and today her ally, has won the admiration of the whole empire in her long struggle against Japanese aggression. So immense that even her provinces have the area and population of a European country. Primitive her villages and river habitation, yet modern her ports and cities. China for centuries has elected and fought to live her life in her own way. Ruston and Hornsby Limited hope that the association in times of stress between Britain and China will in the times of peace be the forerunner of greater happiness and prosperity for the industrious Chinese. Ruston and Hornsby Limited, Lincoln, England. Makers of dependable oil engines since 1892.
That's a nice bit of casual racism there from 1942.
Yeah, I mean, it's just... I can't say I fully agree with the advert, but I would just like to point out, it shows you how, considering we're talking about like China and trade wars and stuff, it shows you a very different view of the world maybe 76 years ago. So
yeah, and that was before China would have become a communist country as well in 1942. Yeah, they would have still been along those lines. So that's why we were so friendly with them back then.
And now for a quick polls update. My quick look at the polls, Rob, looks like Conservatives were up end of November, which we think was before kind of the news of the deal had kind of properly sunk in. That was what we discussed last time. And now we have Labour up 2 and then 2 ties with the Conservatives and Labour both on 38 in the last 2 polls. What are your thoughts on all that?
Yeah, I think this is crazy, or at least shows the fact that the country is still super split. I said last week that I expected Labour to be ahead in the polls because the Conservative Party seemed in such a mess. They're divided. We're looking at a government that has lost 3 votes against itself. At this point, you should, I thought we should expect that the Conservative support should be waning. However, it still stays rigidly at this figure of about 38%, and Labour are unable to go ahead and beat it. I don't know if it's because Labour have failed to come up with their own alternative to the deal, other than the fact that, no, we don't like it, we're angling for a general election. But these poll numbers, to me, certainly suggest that if Labour got a general election, there's no guarantee that they would automatically be able to form a majority government that would be able to go to the EU and negotiate any stronger than the Conservatives. And that's really surprising. I don't know what you think.
Yeah, I think we've touched on this before. It is surprising to me how hard it's been for the Labour Party. And it's not just Corbyn. I mean, it's like in general, because this is how people would vote in their local area for their MP. So I appreciate that the leader of a party is important and does affect people's views, but you're also talking about people out in their communities. And I think it speaks, as you say, to how split the country is over Brexit. Not to say that everyone who votes Conservative is a Leaver and everyone who votes Labour is Remain. We know that's not the case. But things have become very partisan and very split down the middle in a lot of ways. And I think that probably, you probably have that problem for people in Labour constituencies, that where the vote was close to Remain Leave, that, if they are worried they're going to get a Remain MP in, then that will lead to a higher chance of people voting Conservative there or for someone else. And that can affect these polls. It is, it's still baffling to me that Labour have not been able to make much mileage out of this. But I suppose, as you say, the point is they don't have anything concrete. They can't say, oh, we've gone off to the EU and we've come up with this deal. Would you like this deal instead? Because they're just not in a position to be able to do that. They just have to sit and criticise from the sidelines. And I think the problem is they've been doing that for a while now. And while we know in general that opposition parties get more support because they can essentially criticise from the sidelines without having to do anything hard, it just doesn't seem to be working. And I'm not 100% sure why on that.
I think some of it may have to do with the sort of tension, the tightrope Jeremy Corbyn has to walk with Brexit. He has to both appeal to Leave voting constituencies in the north and Remain ones in the south. Also, some of his personal conviction. So I think one of the biggest examples of this was PMQs midweek. The government had just lost 3 votes on the Tuesday. On midday on Wednesday, they had Prime Minister's question. This is the time before Jeremy Corbyn, everybody thought, to sort of like put his foot on Theresa.
Put the knife in.
Yeah, stick the knife in. Put foot on her neck and really say, okay, I'm going to bash you on Brexit. I'm going to bash you about how much of a mess you've made on this. Jeremy Corbyn had 6 questions on the UN poverty report. Not a single one on Brexit. Now, I'm not saying that the UN poverty report isn't something that's worth talking about. It may have been a welcome break from the 2 weeks of Brexit chat that's going on in the Commons. However, it seemed bizarre that when your government is at such a weak point over the point of Brexit to avoid it completely. Theresa May seemed pleasantly surprised and sort of batted the questions away as you'd expect a Conservative leader to do when targeted on that line. And yeah, it seemed baffling to me that they're unable to capitalise when, in football terms, the goal is open, it's gaping, just shoot. And somehow he's managing to blast the ball over the bar every opportunity he's given at the moment. So that might be some reason why we're seeing this tie at the moment. No side is able to capitalise on their position when it really matters.
Yeah, so interesting times ahead. And I think we're gonna end the episode there. 2 weeks away is the 23rd of December. Are we going to do something special for Christmas? I assume there won't be any immediate news. I mean, we'll have 2 weeks of news to talk about maybe. But do we want to do something slightly special for the Christmas period to tide people over?
Yeah, I don't know what that will be, but we'll see what we can come up with in 2 weeks' time. There'll definitely be news to talk about. Like we say, this vote will have gone through. We might be looking for a very Merry Christmas or one sort of hiding under the sofa, just, huddling around our loved ones, getting a tin of Spam and all the tin foods we can to just settle down for the long, hard winter. So, if it's that, then we'll bring some Christmas cheer.
Join us next time for hopefully some good news with relation to Brexit. And also just to note that Rob will be joining us on the not the next published episode, but the next to be recorded episode of Hat of Many Things to tell me why sports ball is so good. As always, you can find us on Facebook at Unparliamentary Language, Reddit at /r/unparliamentary, on Twitter at unparlpodcast, on Instagram at unparlpodcast, and of course, if you really like what we do and want to throw a few dollars our way to help pay for the website and buying more microphones and other things that we need to keep producing these shows, then you can go to patreon.com/TTSS. And I suppose that's it from me. That's good night from me.
And it's a good night from him.
Bye.
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 Bye. Bye.
Bye. That's not silent.
It's the opposite.
And that's Rob being the opposite of silent.